Hi and welcome back to Bike Speeds. This week we are going to service and repair this crashed Endurace CF SL. Previously having had a crash, we're going to sort out and rectify a few issues that we found along the way with this bike through that crash. You can see there that rear derailleur has that nasty graze on it where that's been down on the floor, and you can hear here there's a little bit of noise on this drivetrain. The customer actually brought this in initially because it was making a clicking sound as he described it. He thought it was coming from the bottom bracket area. On that lower 2-3 gears there, distinctive click, and I felt that was running through the derailleur not feeding the chain correctly to the cassette, and we found the reason for that, and it is definitely through that rear derailleur having had that scuff on the road. You can also see here that the rear brake is dragging heavily on that disc. We're going to iron out that problem. This would have been like riding treacle. I should imagine a hill climb on this bike would have been very tiring, and we'll solve that as well. The chain has actually worn to 0.5%, so we need to replace that chain. It's recommended on 11 speed to do that. So the first job for me to do as part of this service is to remove that chain in preparation for the new one. So off comes that chain now. We're now beginning to progress into the service. So we're going to remove the front wheel and the back wheel, and then we can also begin by removing the rear cassette. Now this cassette wasn't actually badly worn. The chain was caught just in the nick of time. I think a few more miles and we would have been looking at a cassette as well. You can see here it's quite oily, but what I noticed about this bike was, although it has been lubricated, it was all very, very dry. The lubricant that was on there was very dry, and we need to clean that off before we put our own lubricants onto the bike. So I'm disconnecting the rear derailleur and removing that from the bike. You can see on the jockey wheels there a little bit of debris build up again from that dry lubricant that's allowing the debris to stick to it. So I need to clean those up so that we get the smooth jockey wheel running with the new chain, which again will all help that noisy drivetrain. Off come the bottle cages. I need to remove these in order to get the front derailleur mount bolt undone, which after we've removed this cable I'll show you. So we actually removed both the bottle cages, because what I will also do is lubricate the accessory holes that they bolt into. Note the spring on the rear of that derailleur, the top spring there has got a little bit of corrosion on it. I'll talk about that more when we lubricate that front derailleur. And also these are power pedals, and they were solid on here, way over tightened, not done to torque spec, so I had to knock those to get them to free up on the threads. So we'll remove those, we'll lubricate that thread when we put them back on and torque them correctly so that they can be removed from bike to bike. I often find with power pedals, the owners of those generally have one set, and they will often swap them from bike to bike. Obviously I don't know with this customer's bike, but that's why I always make sure they're torqued to spec so that they are easier to remove. I removed these pivot pins from the calipers. I want to remove these brake pads because I do need to clean these up and also inspect them and make sure there's still plenty of meat on them, and clean up the caliper. And it's much easier to clean up the caliper without the brake pads in there. And I'll also be dealing with the pivot pin as well, which has a notorious problem, which I'll show you again as we're moving through the service. Next up, I'm going to take the chain set off. Now 11 speed Shimano cranksets are under a recall inspection at the moment, but that only runs up to item numbers up to RF, and these were actually beyond that. So this is at the point where Shimano probably initially realized they had an issue, and this one was a TB, I believe. So it was beyond the letters that are part of that recall inspection. So this one was absolutely fine. And you can see there wasn't too bad, but we will clean that up and make sure everything's okay. And we'll again show you something there when we take that chain set apart that is the reason we do it. So I'm now removing the jockey wheels because I do need to clean those up, and I'll also wash down the body of the derailleur. So let's start with this chain set. We're going to remove all these bolts. People sometimes ask us why we do this, and this is the exact reason why we do it on this chain set. So off comes that big ring. You can see here the corrosion from those stainless steel fittings on the big rings here, and you can see that powdery residue. That's where it's never been lubricated, having the corrosion forming between the two surfaces, and it literally goes like powder. So that's corrosion forming through having not been removed previously and not lubricated correctly. So we're going to deal with that when we've cleaned them up. So We have put the cassette through the ultrasonic cleaner, but most of the other components we washed down with warm soapy water. It was enough to remove most of the debris that was on these parts, and so that's what we're doing here with the chain set. We're just washing that down. But before we do wash down the derailleurs, we want to put in these blanking covers onto the electronic fitting to make sure that it doesn't get wet inside, and then we can wash that down. There was quite a bit of grease build up on this front derailleur, and obviously the springs that were a little bit corroded, so we wash all that down and then we can lubricate that as we go. So rear derailleur here, again washing it down, everything there is good. And then the cassette, which has been through the ultrasonic clean, you can see there the grease just washes straight off it. Quite nice really, and there was nothing wrong with this cassette, so all well and good. Again, we'll dry that off with a microfiber towel going between the teeth, and then these individual sprockets, we can dry those off and everything there will look as new. Next up, the jockey wheels. These have a bearing in the center of them, and they were actually in quite good condition, so we didn't need to do anything with the bearings of these. We are just giving them a little bit of a degrease and making sure that all that grease residue that was on those is cleaned off so they're as new. And then we're using a little bit of our thread locker here to hold that together. We do sell the Park Tool thread locker on our website. We also sell the grease selections that we do, and a lot of other items, chains and so on, that we use in our daily servicing and that we bring you on the videos are available on our website. We always put the link to the website in the description below, so maybe next time you're servicing your bike, you'll check out our shop and maybe buy some of your items from us. So we're now also lubricating this rear derailleur. I treat these like a mechanical derailleur. I lubricate all these pivot points, lubricate the springs where I can. And this is why we lubricate this main spring with our premium grease on all derailleurs. We can wipe that in, that will just help stop that corrosion that you can see forming there on that top spring. Lubricate the pivot points, especially this little actuator arm inside here. They often seize up, so we lubricate that as well, and that front derailleur is now ready to go. Now you can see here the white on these bolts. This is actually called fretting, and this is the reason why we use our anti-seize grease on a lot of the threads. Something we don't often talk about is fretting, but in this instance that's what's there. It's where the thread has been cut against itself, against the other metal, so we want to make sure that that doesn't happen. And obviously we want to stop those main rings from future corrosion, so we've also lubricated with general purpose grease the spines, and then we've also lubricated the bolts, so when it all goes back together it reduces the chance of future corrosion as best possible. So that's what I'm dealing with when I'm servicing bikes. I appreciate that these are going to be coming in periodically, so we can redo that as we need to, and if it's serviced regularly it will actually help the longevity of these components just through regular servicing. Same here with the through axle. These often bind into wheels, they can corrode into a wheel and make them impossible to get out, and often they're not lubricated from new or from the previous service, which I think is what happened here. So again, general purpose grease and a bit of our anti-seize grease on the threads. Now I'm going to clean up the brake pads. Both sets of brake pads on this bike have plenty of wear left in them. They weren't too bad, but you can see there the one on the left how that's got a little bit of impregnation, a little bit of build up of debris on there. The one on the right I've already cleaned down and is now ready to go back on the bike, so we can now clean the left one and they'll both be absolutely spot on. Now it's time to wash the frame down. I always start the wash down with the snow foam spray. That starts to break down the greases and also pulls off all the loose dirt and debris. Then I follow that up with the big softy brush, as I'm sure you all know by now. That does exactly what it's supposed to do, and it's definitely a product worth checking out on our website. Quite like the colour of this bike. It was this lovely pastel shade, nice gloss finish to it as well. I do like coloured bikes, as I've mentioned in the past, and this one was no exception. It had some marks on the rear chainstays that initially I thought would take quite a lot of work to remove, but actually they washed off, which was quite pleasing really. It was quite an involved service, so to see the marks coming off the frame quite easily was very nice. Also wash down the saddle, make sure everything's clean right the way through, and then I can use a microfiber towel to really lift off that water and also wipe off any marks. The bike actually came up really nice, and thankfully, although this had clearly been on the ground at some point, none of the bodywork or paintwork was damaged on it. Now I'm going to turn my attention to the wheel. So the first thing for me to do here is to sand down the disc rotor. I like to sand these down. They get little scores in them that can cause some of that squealing that you get on a brake. So I'll sand this down and then I'll measure the thickness of this disc rotor to make sure it's still within tolerance. and I'll give that to the customer on the service sheet, and everything there is nice and clean, so we can wipe that down with a little bit of brake cleaner and a fresh microfiber towel there to really remove any of that debris that we've got on there. Next up, I'm going to wash the wheel down. What I tend to find with rear wheels especially is you get a bit of centrifugal force off of the cassette and chain when it's been lubricated. It tends to flick out and just sit on these rims, especially noticeable on this one on the drive side, but thankfully it wiped completely off. The other thing I also noticed about this rim was that the decals on it were actually a different colour slightly to the front wheel, which would suggest that at some point in its life it has been replaced, but I don't think that was after the crash. I think that the wheel was part of that crash because of a buckle that we had in it that I'll show you shortly. So I'm putting the cassette back on there. You can see how clean that's come up, really nice. Torque that up to spec, and that's really good, and then I can flick the wheel over and also check the lock ring for the disc rotor here, which actually is the same torque setting. So you can see there it was a little bit loose, it did need torquing up. And then the other thing I'm going to do with this rear wheel is to rotate the tyre so that I've got the logo of the tyre right over the valve. And I also did that with the front wheel. The valve wasn't central to the logo. It's just a little detail really that I like to do when I present the bikes, and also helps you identify where punctures are. If you know that that logo's always over the valve at the 12 o'clock position, it just works nicely on the bike to have your logos over the valve. So we'll inflate that one up, and we also check the pressure on the front after we turned that tyre, so we can put the valve cap onto there, and that wheel is almost ready to fit. I always inspect tyres when I service a bike, and you can see here a little bit of debris in the centre of this tyre. This is one of my favourite things with servicing, because I know that this is a puncture, but it hasn't happened yet. That will work its way through the tyre, will give the rider a puncture at some point, and I've saved that puncture. So I've saved them 10 minutes on the side of the road without them even realising it at times. Now this rear wheel was buckled. You can see there that we've tensioned it left and right across the wheel. You can see on the next graph that shows how at the bottom right hand side there you've got a flat spot between 6 of the spokes actually, and that's where 2 of the spokes were too tight and the one between them was too low. So we've evened that tension around the entire wheel, and I think that was probably part of the crash as well. So next up we put in the chain set. We're going to start to rebuild the bike now, and then we can deal with one other big problem that this bike had. So on goes the chain set first. The left hand arm, this is the tensioner for the bearing. We never want to over tighten that. In goes the bolts for the pedal arm. And then I always, with the chain set and the front derailleur, I always torque them up. They're very hard to do as a last part of the service where I do go through the bike with a torque wrench, because they do operate in left and right, and we want to make sure that everything's tight there for adjustments. On go the pedals. You can see there I used that anti-seize grease in the threads, tighten those up, and then when we go through the remainder of the bike with a torque wrench, we'll make sure that they're tightened up correctly and not over tightened. So on goes the left hand pedal there as well. Give that a little tweak before we torque it. You can see how free that bearing was there, spinning backwards on itself. On goes the front derailleur. Set that to its position and plug that one in. So that's now ready to roll. We can torque that up before we put the bottle cages on and before we go through the rest of the bike. This is a pivot pin that goes through the brake pads. One of the things that I always do with these, I lubricate the thread, because they're very prone to seizing in the calipers, making them very hard to get out. And then I'll put in the pads, and then in will go that pin. You can see there the thread's lubricated, and then these are the ones with the slot head, so don't over tighten them, don't go too mad, because they do have this safety clip on them, and then I can remove that next time I service the bike relatively easily. Same with the front one, that's been lubricated. In go the pads, and the pads are now all clean, the caliper's all clean, the thread on that has been lubricated. On goes the safety clip, and everything there is ready to ride. So we can put the front wheel in now. In goes the back wheel, but before I put the rear derailleur on, I need to check the alignment of this derailleur hanger, and actually this was out quite a long way. This had a fair old knock when this went down on the ground, and it had never been addressed, so we realign that up. A little final little adjustment there, and then I can go right the way around the wheel, make sure it's central to the rim. Obviously I've trued this rim now, so I can check it in all its spots, and everything there is now good, and that is definitely the reason why this bike was clicking the way it was. On goes the rear derailleur, plug that in, and so I can now put on a brand new chain. We've already sized this chain. They're not sized out of the packet. I occasionally see chains that have been on bikes where they haven't been sized correctly and they drape down where they're too long because they haven't been shortened for the length of chain stay or the gearing that the bike has on it. So we've already sized this, pop that on, and that is now spot on. So I'm going to lubricate the accessory bolt holes before I put the bottle cages on. Again, I'm using our anti-seize grease there. These again can corrode in. You often have a stainless steel bolt into an aluminium hole, so we want to make sure that doesn't corrode. So we've lubricated those and they're on perfectly. Now I've plugged in the Di2. You can see here I've got 4 updates on the shifters, the rear derailleur, and most noticeably the battery. The battery's one I'm often nervous about because occasionally when you do an update on those, you actually have to unplug them and replug them into the system to get them to operate again, and that can be involved in itself. So thankfully for me, none of that on this particular bike. Everything went well there. So firmware all updated, and then I also did a system check on this bike, which we haven't shown you, but we go right through the system on the software to make sure everything's okay. And you can see there it's changing gear perfectly. We've lost that ticking noise that we had and that general noise that was on that rear drivetrain. Everything there is now spot on. Now I do need to still adjust this rear brake, so I undo the mount first. I'll spin the wheel 3 or 4 times, pull in the brake very rapidly to centralize that disc, and then I can do up those fittings. And as you can see here, now the back wheel spins much freer. This will be a different bike uphill and a different bike coming to junctions as well. So very pleased with that. Front brake was okay, but this is why we torque a bike. Note here how we've got a few turns in the torque wrench there for the left hand shifter, yet the right hand shifter was okay. And then we torque up the crown, and then on the next set of bolts, which is the steerer tube, again you'll see the same story as with the shifters, where this top one turns a few turns before it torques off and the bottom one is perfect. This suggests to me that in the lifetime of this bike, it's never actually had a torque wrench on it where someone has gone through the bike and made sure that everything is evenly tightened up. We've got various fittings here that are loose or inconsistently tightened. So it really shows to me that this bike has not been torqued up, and you'll see that again on the front brake caliper in a second. Obviously the rear we've already had off, but this we haven't touched, and we've got quite a few turns in that top one, and yet the bottom one was perfect. So yeah, this bike really did need this service from the point of view of getting everything torqued correctly and to spec. So you can see here from the before and afters, the bike has come up beautifully. We've solved the crash issues that it had. We've checked all the firmware and updated it. It now has that lovely new chain on there. All the tyres are sorted and lined up. We've saved that next puncture for the bike, and I think it's going to be amazing to ride. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please do like and subscribe, and we'll see you again very soon. Bye for now.